Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there are warriors who stride across battlefields like living gods, their very presence enough to turn the tide of wars that span entire star systems. Among these demigods, the Primarchs stand tallest, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering crafted by the Emperor of mankind himself. Yet even among these legendary figures, there exists one whose story is written not in the glorious light of victory parades, but in the silent spaces between heartbeats, in the darkness that gathers at the edges of battlefields when fear takes hold. His name is Corvus Corax, the Raven Lord, Primarch of the 19th Legion, and master of a warfare so subtle that enemies often fall before they even realize death has come for them. When we speak of strength in the context of Warhammer 40,000, we often conjure images of raw physical might, of primarchs like Vulcan, who could match the Emperor himself in feats of pure power, or warriors like Angron, whose rage-fueled brutality could tear through armies like parchment. But strength takes many forms in this universe of endless war, and Corvus Corax represents a different kind of power entirely. His is the strength of the shadow, the precision strike that decapitates enemy command structures before battle is truly joined, the guerrilla warfare that transforms impossible odds into inevitable victory. To understand how strong Corvus Corax truly is, we must first understand that his power lies not merely in the transhuman physiology he shares with his brother Primarchs, nor solely in the advanced war gear and weapons he wields with such deadly proficiency. No, Corax's true strength emerges from something far more profound. It is the combination of a mind honed by oppression and revolution, a body engineered to surpass human limitation, and abilities that blur the line between the material and the immaterial, between what can be seen and what lurks just beyond perception. The Raven Guard Legion that fights under his command reflects this philosophy perfectly. Where other legions might deploy in grand formations, overwhelming their foes through sheer force of arms and indomitable will, the sons of Corax strike from unexpected angles, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, leaving nothing but confusion and corpses in their wake. This is not cowardice or weakness, as some of his more straightforward brothers might have once believed. Rather, it represents a supremely pragmatic understanding of warfare's true nature. Why sacrifice thousands when hundreds can accomplish the same objective? Why fight on your enemy's terms when you can dictate your own? But Corvus Corax is more than just a tactical genius or a master of stealth warfare. His story is one of transformation, of a being who began his existence as a liberator of the oppressed and evolved, through tragedy and loss, into something that even his creator might not fully recognize. From the revolutionary who freed an entire moon from tyrannical rule, to the broken commander who watched his legion nearly destroyed through treachery, to the warp-touched hunter who now stalks the Eye of Terror seeking vengeance against those who betrayed everything he held dear. Corvus Corax's journey spans the entire scope of human experience, compressed into the existence of a being who transcends humanity itself. Today, we embark on a journey through shadow and fire, through triumph and tragedy, to answer a question that has fascinated Warhammer enthusiasts for decades. How strong is Corvus Corax? What makes the Raven Lord one of the most formidable Primarchs to ever exist? And perhaps most intriguingly, what has he become in the 10,000 years since the Horus heresy tore the Imperium apart? The answers we discover may surprise you, for in examining Corvus Corax, we find that true strength sometimes whispers rather than roars, that power can manifest in the space between shadows, and that vengeance, when pursued with singular focus across 10 millennia, can transform a warrior into something that even demons themselves have learned to fear. Origins: the prison moon of Lycaeus. Every Primarch's story begins with tragedy. for that is the nature of their creation and scattering. When the Chaos Gods, in their infinite malice, stole the Emperor's 20 infant sons and scattered them across the galaxy, they did so with the specific intent of corrupting these beings before they could fulfill their intended purpose. Each Primarch landed on a world that would shape them, forge them, and in many cases, come close to breaking them. But perhaps no world was quite as deliberately cruel in its lessons as Lycaeus, the airless moon where an infant demigod would learn what it meant to be truly powerless, truly enslaved. Lycaeus orbited the forge world of Kievar, a planet whose massive manufactorums produced weapons, vehicles, and equipment for the expanding human empire that existed before the Emperor's unification. But such production required raw materials, and the moon provided them in abundance. Massive underground mining operations honeycombed Lycaeus's interior, extracting precious minerals and ores that would be processed in Kievar's factories. This mining operation required labor, and the tech guilds that ruled Kievar had long ago solved that problem in the most efficient way they knew: slavery. The slaves of Lycaeus came from all walks of life: political dissidents who had questioned the guild's authority, workers who had failed to meet impossible quotas, criminals whose crimes ranged from the serious to the fabricated. Entire families sometimes found themselves consigned to Lycaeus's brutal depths, condemned to work until their bodies gave out, which in that airless, radiation-soaked environment never took very long. Life expectancy on Lycaeus was measured in months, not years, and the overseers made sure every slave understood that their existence was valued only slightly more than the ore they extracted. Into this hell, a Primarch fell from the sky. The infant who would become Corvus Corax was discovered by the slaves shortly after his arrival. Even as a newborn, he was remarkable. His skin was pale as fresh snow, his eyes dark as the void between stars, and his hair, even then, showed the black coloring that would become his signature. The slaves who found him recognized immediately that this child was special, different in ways that transcended the obvious physical abnormalities. They hid him from the overseers, passing him from one family group to another, each taking turns caring for this strange foundling, even as they struggled to keep themselves alive. But a Primarch grows fast, impossibly fast by human standards. Within weeks, the infant was walking and talking. Within months, he had the physical development of a human adolescent. And with that rapid growth came an equally rapid intellectual and emotional development. The child absorbed everything around him: the casual cruelty of the overseers, the quiet desperation of the slaves, the brutal mathematics of an existence where human life was literally calculated in terms of resource extraction efficiency. More than that, he absorbed the lessons that only those who have been truly powerless can teach. He learned patience from slaves who had waited years for the smallest opportunity to strike back. He learned subtlety from workers who had to hide any spark of rebellion, lest they and their families be made examples of. He learned tactics from whispered conversations about previous uprisings, failed rebellions that were spoken of only in the most secure moments, stories of what had been tried and why it had failed. The growing Primarch took the name Corax, which in the language of Lycaeus meant deliverer. It was a name given to him by the slaves who had come to see in this pale-skinned youth, with his impossible growth and fierce intelligence, the answer to prayers they had long since stopped believing would be answered. But Corax himself understood something his adoptive people did not yet grasp. Deliverance would not come through divine intervention or the benevolence of their masters. If freedom was to be won, it would have to be taken, paid for in blood and sacrifice. As he matured, Corax began to display abilities that even he did not fully understand. Sometimes, when the overseers walked through the slave quarters, their eyes would slide past him as if he weren't there at all. He could move through spaces that should have been impossible to traverse unseen, could vanish into shadows that seemed too thin to conceal anything larger than a child. These were the first manifestations of the ability that would later be called the Wraith Slip, a psychic gift that allowed Corax to manipulate perception itself, to become functionally invisible even to those looking directly at him. But perhaps more dangerous than any physical or psychic ability was the mind that Corax brought to bear on the problem of liberation. He studied the guards' patrol patterns, noting every irregularity, every moment of inattention. He mapped out the supply lines that kept Kiavar's factories running, identifying choke points and vulnerabilities. He organized the slaves into cells, small groups that could act independently if necessary, ensuring that the capture or death of one group would not compromise the entire resistance. When Corax finally decided the time was right to act, he was no longer the frightened infant who had fallen from the sky. He was a young man who had absorbed centuries of accumulated wisdom about resistance and rebellion, distilled and refined by a mind that could process information and formulate strategies at speeds no normal human could match. More than that, he had become a symbol of hope to the slaves of Lycaeus, a living reminder that their oppression was not inevitable, that the tech guild's power was not absolute. The revolution, when it came, was brutally efficient. Corax had identified key targets, the communications hubs that allowed the overseers to call for reinforcements, the armories where weapons were stored, the command centers from which mining operations were controlled. In a single coordinated strike that took place over the course of just a few hours, the entire command structure on Lycaeus was decapitated. The overseers, so confident in their technological superiority and military might, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Every attempt the tech guilds made to retake Lycaeus failed. Their heavily armed troops, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves ambushed in the very tunnels and caverns they had built. Their superior weapons and armor meant nothing when attacks came from unexpected angles, when enemies melted away before reinforcements could arrive. Corax had learned from the slaves' previous failed uprisings, had identified the mistakes that had led to their defeat, and had crafted a strategy that turned the guild's own infrastructure against them. But Corax understood something that many revolutionaries do not. Winning freedom is only the first step. The real challenge comes in securing that freedom permanently. The tech guilds still controlled Kiavar, still possessed the industrial might and military resources to eventually overwhelm Lycaeus through sheer attrition. So Corax, with the cold calculation that would become his hallmark, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. Using atomic mining charges, the very tools that the slaves had used to extract ore from Lycaeus's depths, Corax struck at the heart of Kiavar's 5 largest cities. The attacks were surgical, devastating, and designed to send a very specific message. Continue this war and watch your entire civilization burn. Thousands died in those atomic fires, and Corax knew every single number, carried the weight of every death as surely as if he had killed each person with his own hands. But the strategy worked. The tech guilds, already weakened by the loss of their mineral supplies and now facing the destruction of their industrial base, collapsed into civil war. Different factions blamed each other for the catastrophe. Old rivalries resurfaced, and what had been a unified oligarchy splintered into competing power blocks. In the chaos that followed, Corax was able to negotiate from a position of strength, securing not just Lycaeus's freedom, but also a more equitable relationship between the moon and the planet it orbited. The slaves of Lycaeus renamed their home Deliverance, and in doing so, they named their deliverer as well. Corvus Corax had achieved something that should have been impossible, a successful slave revolt against a technologically superior enemy. He had proven that with sufficient planning, proper tactics, and absolute commitment to victory, even the most overwhelming odds could be overcome. It was at this moment of triumph, standing among the free people of Deliverance, that Corax experienced something that would change his existence forever. The Emperor of Mankind, Master of the Imperium, and Creator of the Primarchs, had finally found his lost son, reunion with the Emperor, and the Great Crusade. The arrival of the Emperor on Deliverance was, by all accounts, an event that defied description. For the people of the newly freed moon, who had only recently cast off the chains of their oppression, the appearance of a golden-clad figure who seemed to radiate power and authority must have been deeply unsettling. For Corax, however, the moment carried a different weight entirely. Here, at last, was an explanation for what he was, why he was different, and perhaps, most importantly, proof that he was not alone in his transhuman existence. The historical records tell us that the Emperor and Corax sequestered themselves for a full day and night, speaking of matters that remain sealed to this day. But we can infer certain elements of that conversation from what followed. Corax, who had just led a successful revolution built on principles of liberation and freedom from tyranny, was being asked to join a crusade that would, in many ways, impose a different kind of tyranny across the stars. The Emperor's vision of human unity required conquest, required the subjugation of human worlds that had developed their own cultures and governments in isolation. Yet Corax agreed. He agreed on one condition, that the Emperor would help bring lasting peace to Kievar, ensuring that the relationship between the planet and its moon would be rebuilt on more equitable terms. This tells us something crucial about Corax's character. He was not an ideologue who valued abstract principles over practical realities. He understood that perfect freedom was an impossibility in a galaxy filled with Xenos threats and chaos corruption. What mattered was that people were given the opportunity to live with dignity, to have agency in their own lives, to not be ground down by systems that treated them as nothing more than resources to be exploited. When Corax emerged from that meeting, he had accepted command of the 19th Legion, the Raven Guard, and had pledged his service to the Great Crusade. The massive fortress monastery known as the Raven Spire was constructed on Deliverance, and Corax began the process of reshaping his legion to reflect the lessons he had learned in the mines and tunnels of the prison moon. The Raven Guard under Corax became something unique among the Space Marine legions. While other Primarchs might celebrate the martial glory of their warriors, might encourage their sons to seek honor through heroic last stands and glorious charges, Corax instilled in his legion a very different philosophy. Victory was the only honor that mattered, and the most efficient path to victory was the one that cost the fewest lives, both among your own forces and, where possible, among civilians caught in the crossfire. This philosophy put Corax at odds with several of his brother Primarchs almost immediately. The Night Haunter, Conrad Kurze, employed terror tactics that Corax found abhorrent. While both Primarchs specialized in fear and stealth, Kurze reveled in the suffering his methods caused, while Corax saw such cruelty as fundamentally unnecessary. The two were frequently compared, both in appearance and in their approach to warfare, and these comparisons disgusted Corax. He saw in Kurze what he might have become if he had given in to bitterness and rage, if he had allowed the cruelty he had witnessed on Lycaeus to poison his own soul. Similarly, Corax clashed with Primarchs who favored more conventional approaches to warfare. Rogel Dawn, with his fortress building and defensive strategies, represented a methodical approach that Corax could respect, even if he didn't always agree with it. But others, like the more aggressive Primarchs who threw their legions into frontal assaults, struck Corax as wasteful. Every Space Marine who died in a glorious but ultimately unnecessary charge was a warrior who could have served the Imperium for centuries more if only his commander had been willing to fight smarter rather than harder. The relationship between Corax and the War Master Horus was particularly complex. Initially, the Raven Guard fought frequently under Horus's command, and the two Primarchs' approaches to warfare seemed complementary. Horus valued results, and Corax delivered them with remarkable consistency. The Raven Guard became renowned for their ability to achieve objectives that other legions deemed impossible, infiltrating enemy strongholds, assassinating enemy leaders, and generally creating chaos behind enemy lines that allowed the main Imperial forces to advance with minimal resistance. But as time went on, tensions developed. Horus, for all his tactical brilliance and charisma, had a streak of pragmatism that sometimes crossed into ruthlessness. He was willing to sacrifice units he deemed acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic objectives, a calculation that Corax, who remembered what it felt like to be considered expendable, found increasingly difficult to stomach. An argument between the two nearly came to blows, and after that incident, Corax ensured that the Raven Guard operated more independently, taking objectives that suited their particular skill set without being bound to Horus's grand strategies. Another source of tension within the Legion came from the Terran-born Marines, those who had been recruited from Earth before the Raven Guard was united with its Primarch. These warriors had been trained in a different tradition, one that emphasized terror tactics and psychological warfare in ways that reminded Corax uncomfortably of the Night Lords. While he couldn't simply purge these veterans, many of whom were skilled and loyal, Corax found ways to ensure they didn't unduly influence the Legion's culture. Gradually, through a series of deployments to the galactic fringes and deep space crusades from which few returned, the Terran element of the Raven Guard was winnowed down. This decision would haunt Corax later, when he learned that one of his own brothers, Horus himself, had used a similar tactic to eliminate loyalist elements within his own legion prior to the heresy. The realization that he had, in his own way, engaged in a purge based on cultural rather than tactical considerations added another layer of complexity to Corax's already conflicted relationship with the Imperium he served. During the Great Crusade, Corax proved his worth time and again. When other legions predicted campaigns would take months or even years, the Raven Guard accomplished the same objectives in weeks. They specialized in decapitation strikes, eliminating enemy leadership so quickly that opposing forces collapsed into chaos before they could mount an organized defense. They excelled at infiltration, with entire companies vanishing behind enemy lines, emerging weeks or months later after having systematically dismantled their opponent's infrastructure from within. But perhaps most importantly, Corax demonstrated something that not all of his brothers understood, that strength could be measured in more than just conquest. The Raven Guard, when they brought worlds into compliance, did so in ways that minimized civilian casualties. Corax understood that these populations would become Imperial citizens, that they would be expected to support the continued expansion of the Imperium, and that people who had been brutalized and traumatized made poor long-term subjects. Better to remove the leadership that opposed the Imperium's arrival, and then work with the remaining population to integrate them into the larger structure. This approach earned Corax both admiration and criticism. Some saw it as weakness, a failure to instill the proper fear and respect for Imperial authority. Others recognized it as a long-term strategic approach that would pay dividends for centuries to come. Regardless of how his methods were perceived, Corax continued to fight his way, secure in the knowledge that the results spoke for themselves. And then came Istvan V, and everything Corax had built came crashing down. Physical abilities and combat prowess. To truly understand how strong Corvus Corax is, we must first examine the foundation upon which all his other abilities rest, his transhuman physiology as a Primarch. The Emperor created the Primarchs not merely as enhanced humans, but as living weapons that incorporated the finest elements of genetic engineering, biomechanical augmentation, and what can only be described as warpcraft. Each Primarch was designed to embody specific traits and capabilities, optimized for particular forms of warfare and command. In Corax's case, the Emperor crafted a being who represented the ultimate expression of speed, precision, and adaptability, while Primarchs like Vulcan were engineered for raw physical power, and brothers like Angron were designed for sustained close combat ferocity. Corax was built for a different kind of warfare entirely. Every aspect of his physiology reflects this fundamental design philosophy. Let us begin with the most obvious attribute, his physical form itself. Corax stood tall even among his brother Primarchs. though he lacked the massive bulk of warriors like Ferrus Manus or the intimidating presence of Rogel Dawn. His frame was lean, almost gaunt by Primarch standards, with long limbs that gave him an extraordinary reach advantage in close combat. But this apparent leanness was deceptive. The muscle density in a Primarch's body far exceeds anything found in baseline humanity or even in Space Marines. Where a human athlete might have muscle tissue that's perhaps twice as dense as an ordinary person's, and a Space Marine might multiply that by 3 or 4, a Primarch's musculature operates on an entirely different scale. Corax could tear through reinforced armor with his bare hands, could lift weights that would crush a Space Marine, could exert force that would shatter bones and pulverize flesh with the slightest application of effort. Yet he rarely needed to resort to such crude displays of strength. His fighting style emphasized precision over power, speed over strength, efficiency over endurance. And when we speak of Corax's speed, we're discussing something that challenges human comprehension. Space Marines, with their enhanced reflexes and accelerated neural processing, can react to threats in fractions of a second that would leave baseline humans frozen in place. But Corax moved faster still. In the historical accounts of his battles, there are descriptions of the Raven Lord engaging multiple opponents simultaneously, his lightning claws flickering too fast for the naked eye to follow, leaving nothing but a blur of motion and a shower of severed limbs in his wake. One particularly vivid account from the Great Crusade describes Corax fighting through an enemy command center. The fortress had been designed to be unassailable, with overlapping fields of fire, reinforced positions, and defensive measures that should have made infiltration impossible. Corax entered alone, his wraith slip rendering him invisible to the defenders. When he finally revealed himself, standing in the heart of their command structure, the enemy leaders had perhaps 2 seconds to register his presence before he moved. The witness who provided this account, a Raven Guard sergeant named Bran, described it as watching darkness itself come alive. Corax's movements were so fluid, so perfectly economical, that he seemed almost to be dancing rather than fighting. His lightning claws, the famed Raven's talons, moved in patterns that were simultaneously beautiful and horrifying, each strike ending a life or removing a limb with surgical precision. By the time the defenders' reinforcements arrived, less than a minute later, Corax had already vanished back into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but corpses and the chaos that comes from losing an entire command structure in the space of a few heartbeats. But speed and precision are useless without the sensory capabilities to process information fast enough to act on it. Here again, Corax's design proved its worth. His vision operated across a broader spectrum than even other Primarchs. He could see clearly in conditions that would render his brothers effectively blind, could track minute movements at distances that would defeat even augmented vision. His hearing was similarly enhanced, capable of distinguishing individual heartbeats in a crowded room, of identifying the subtle changes in breathing that indicate fear or deception. These sensory capabilities worked in conjunction with a mind that could process tactical data at speeds that seemed almost precognitive. While Primarchs like Sanguinius might have genuine foresight, seeing possible futures before they occurred, Corax achieved something similar through sheer analytical capability. He could assess a battlefield in an instant, identifying weak points, predicting enemy movements, and formulating counter-strategies before his opponents even realized they were being analyzed. This cognitive processing speed had another crucial benefit. It made Corax extraordinarily difficult to surprise or ambush. His awareness of his surroundings operated on multiple levels simultaneously. He wasn't just watching for threats in his immediate vicinity, he was constantly modeling potential danger zones, analyzing environmental factors that could conceal enemies, and maintaining a tactical map of his surroundings that updated in real time based on new information. Catching the Raven Lord off guard required not just skill, but circumstance that eliminated his sensory advantages, something that very few opponents ever managed to achieve. Corax's arsenal was carefully chosen to complement his combat style. The Raven's talons, his signature lightning claws, were masterworks of the Mechanicus's highest art. These weapons generated powerful energy fields that could slice through the strongest armor like parchment, could shear through flesh and bone without resistance. In Corax's hands, they became extensions of his will, weapons that moved with such speed and precision that they seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. But the lightning claws were not his only weapons. Corax also wielded a power whip, an unusual choice for a Primarch, but one that perfectly suited his fighting style. The whip allowed him to strike at opponents from unexpected angles, to disarm enemies or entangle them before moving in for the kill. In one recorded engagement, Corax used his whip to decapitate 3 enemy commanders in a single strike, the monomolecular filament passing through armor and flesh as if through water. For ranged combat, Corax favored a pair of Archaeotech pistols known as Wrath and Justice, weapons whose origins dated back to the Dark Age of technology. These weren't crude mass-produced firearms, but precision instruments that fired bolt rounds with accuracy that would be impossible for any other marksman. Combined with Corax's enhanced vision and reflexes, these pistols allowed him to make shots that seemed impossible, eliminating targets at ranges where they believed themselves safe from a warrior wielding primarily close combat weapons. Perhaps most distinctive was Corax's armor and equipment. The sable armor was a masterwork of craftsmanship, designed specifically for the Ravenlord by the Emperor's own artificers. Beyond its obvious protective qualities, the armor incorporated systems that masked Corax's energy signature, making him difficult to detect with advanced sensors. It could also jam enemy communications in his immediate vicinity, creating bubbles of silence that prevented coordinated responses to his infiltration. The armor's most visually striking feature was undoubtedly the Corvidine pinions, the massive wings that extended from Corax's jump pack.
You know, I have to pause here and share something. Out of all the Primarchs I've researched for this channel, Corvus has become one of my personal favorites, and not for the reasons you might expect. It's not just about the cool shadow powers or the tragic backstory. It's that he represents something I think resonates with a lot of us. He's the underdog, the quiet one who gets overlooked while his louder brothers take the center stage. But when the moment comes, when it really matters, he's the one who gets the job done. There's something deeply satisfying about that kind of strength. That kind that doesn't need to announce itself. But anyways, that's just my personal opinion. Let's continue the story.
These weren't mere decorative elements, but functional flight surfaces, crafted to resemble the feathers of the ravens that would become his legion's symbol. The jump pack they were attached to was more advanced than standard Space Marine equipment, allowing for sustained flight and aerial maneuvers that gave Corax a 3-dimensional battlefield awareness that few of his brothers could match. In combat, Corax's preferred tactic was to strike from above, using his jump pack to achieve positions that enemies couldn't easily defend against. There's a famous account from the Compliance of Garland Delta, where Corax spent an entire battle circling above the enemy forces, invisible thanks to his wraith slip, picking off commanders and key personnel with surgical strikes before vanishing back into the sky. The enemy army never even got a clear shot at him, their command structure systematically dismantled by an opponent they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't effectively fight back against. Yet for all his physical capabilities, perhaps Corax's greatest asset in combat was psychological. He understood fear, understood how it could be weaponized, not through cruelty or excess as the Night Lords practiced, but through uncertainty and dread. An enemy who never knows when or where the attack will come, who loses leaders and key personnel to an invisible assailant, who fights against shadows that strike with lethal precision before vanishing. Such an enemy is already half defeated before the main battle begins. When Corax did reveal himself in battle, it was almost always at a moment calculated for maximum psychological impact. The sudden appearance of a Primarch, materializing from nowhere with claws extended and murder in his eyes, was often enough to break enemy morale completely. Those who survived encounters with the Ravenlord spoke of him in hushed tones, describing not just a warrior, but something more primal, more terrifying. They described feeling hunted, feeling as if they were prey being toyed with before the kill. And yet, despite all these fearsome capabilities, those who fought alongside Corax spoke of him with deep respect rather than fear. He was demanding but fair, expecting his sons to live up to the standards he set, but never asking of them anything he wouldn't do himself. He fought beside his legion, not merely commanding from the rear, and when Ravengard fell in battle, Corax mourned them as any father would mourn his sons. This, then, was Corvus Corax at the height of his power during the Great Crusade, a warrior who combined superhuman physical capabilities with tactical genius, who could fight with the savagery of any of his brothers when necessary, but preferred the elegant efficiency of the perfect ambush, the precisely timed strike that ended wars before they truly began. A Primarch who understood that true strength sometimes meant knowing when not to use the full extent of your power, when a lighter touch would achieve better results. And then the Horus Heresy began, and Corax would discover that all his speed, all his tactical brilliance, all his carefully honed skills would barely be enough to survive what was coming. The Wraithslip, Master of Shadows. Among all the Primarchs, each possessed unique abilities that set them apart even from their equally remarkable brothers. Magnus the Red commanded psychic powers that rivaled the Emperor himself. Sanguinius bore literal wings and a gift for foresight. Vulcan's ability to survive and regenerate made him effectively immortal, but perhaps no Primarch possessed an ability quite as mysterious, quite as unsettling as Corvus Corax's Wraithslip. The Wraithslip, also known as Shadow Walk or Shadow Slip depending on who recorded the observation, was unlike conventional psychic abilities. While Primarchs like Magnus shaped reality through force of will, bending the warp to their purposes through ritual and knowledge, Corax's ability seemed almost instinctive, as natural to him as breathing. He didn't need to prepare elaborate psychic workings or draw upon vast reserves of warp energy. He simply decided to vanish, and the universe complied. The exact mechanism of this ability has been the subject of extensive analysis by imperial scholars, tech priests, and what few librarians have been granted access to the sealed records. The most common theory suggests that the Wraithslip operates not by rendering Corax invisible in the traditional sense, but by manipulating the perception of observers. When the ability activates, Corax doesn't disappear so much as he causes those around him to simply not process his presence. Their eyes might register his form, but their brains refuse to acknowledge what they're seeing, sliding past him the way one might overlook a familiar piece of furniture. But this explanation, while perhaps technically accurate, fails to capture the full scope of what the Wraithslip could accomplish. Advanced detection equipment, sensors that operated on principles having nothing to do with human perception, still failed to register Corax's presence when he activated his ability. Automated defense systems, programmed to respond to any intrusion, regardless of whether a human observer noticed, would allow him to pass unharmed. This suggests that the Wraithslip operated on a deeper level than mere perceptual manipulation, that it somehow edited Corax out of local reality in a way that made detection fundamentally impossible. The first recorded instance of Corax using this ability came during his youth on Lycaeus, even before he fully understood what he was doing. The young Primarch found that he could move through the mining complex without the overseers noticing him. Initially, he thought this was simply a matter of being careful, of moving quietly and staying out of sight. But as he grew older and his ability developed, he began to realize that something more profound was occurring. There's an account from one of the older slaves who helped raise Corax, a woman named Nasturi Afrenia, who served as something of an older sister figure to the rapidly growing Primarch. She described watching Corax demonstrate his ability for the first time after he'd become aware of it. He stood directly in front of a guard patrol, close enough that any normal person would have been immediately spotted. Yet the guards walked past him without the slightest indication that they'd seen anything unusual. Nastari herself, knowing where Corax stood, found her eyes wanting to drift past him, her mind trying to convince her that the space he occupied was empty. It was like watching someone fade from a dream, she later wrote in her personal journals. You know they were there a moment ago. You have memories of speaking with them, but when you try to focus on them directly, there's nothing but shadow. As Corax matured and gained greater control over his ability, he discovered he could extend its effects in interesting ways. Not only could he make himself undetectable, but he could create fields of distortion around himself that affected electronic systems. Communications would fail in his immediate vicinity, sensors would return garbage data, and targeting systems would simply refuse to lock onto his position. This made him effectively immune to the kind of high-tech security systems that protected most enemy installations. During the Great Crusade, the Wraith Slip became one of the Raven Guard's greatest tactical assets. Corax could infiltrate enemy positions that should have been completely secure, could walk through defensive lines that were designed to detect and eliminate any intruder, could appear in the heart of enemy command structures with absolutely no warning. The psychological impact of this capability cannot be overstated. How do you defend against an enemy who can simply choose not to be seen? There are numerous accounts from enemies who survived encounters with Corax, though survived might be too strong a word for warriors who lived only because the Raven Lord chose to let them survive, to spread terror among their comrades. They describe the same basic experience, everything seeming normal one moment, then a shadow detaching itself from the darkness, resolving into a towering figure with claws extended. By the time they could react, their leaders were dead, their defenses were compromised, and the pale figure with the black eyes had vanished back into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. But the Wraith Slip had limitations. Corax couldn't maintain it indefinitely. Extended use seemed to tire him, suggesting it drew on some internal reserve that needed time to recover. More significantly, the ability seemed to work best when Corax was alone or with a very small group. He could extend the effect to a few others, allowing small teams of Raven Guard to accompany him on infiltration missions. But doing so reduced the overall effectiveness and increased the mental strain. Combat also disrupted the Wraith Slip. Once Corax engaged an enemy directly, once blood was spilled and violence erupted, the ability would fade. This makes sense from a certain perspective. Stealth is most effective before detection, and once you've revealed yourself through action, the element of surprise is already lost. But it meant that Corax had to be strategic about when he chose to strike, had to ensure that his first attack was devastating enough that any loss of stealth advantage was immediately offset by the damage he'd already inflicted. Interestingly, the Wraith Slip seemed to have varying effectiveness against different types of opponents. Baseline humans found Corax essentially impossible to detect when he was actively using the ability. Space Marines, with their enhanced senses and augmented awareness, could sometimes sense that something was wrong even if they couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Other Primarchs, particularly those with psychic sensitivity like Magnus or Sanguinius, could occasionally perceive Corax, even through the Wraith Slip, though their detection was more instinctive than specific. The Night Haunter, Conrad Kurz, presented a particular challenge. Kurz's own connection to darkness and fear, combined with his precognitive abilities, seemed to partially negate the Wraith Slip's effectiveness. In their few encounters, Kurz demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate where Corax would strike, to counter attacks that should have been impossible to predict. This created a strange dynamic between the two Primarchs, two masters of stealth and psychological warfare who could actually perceive each other in ways that other opponents could not. Perhaps most intriguingly, there are hints that the Wraith Slip was connected to Corax's emotional state. When he was calm, controlled, and focused, the ability worked at peak effectiveness. But when he was angry or emotionally compromised, it became harder to maintain. This suggests a psychological component to the ability, as if Corax's mental state directly influenced his capacity to edit himself from reality. It's worth noting that many psychic abilities in the Warhammer universe are similarly influenced by the user's emotional control, lending credence to the theory that the Wraith Slip, despite its unique characteristics, was ultimately a form of psychic power. The Raven Guard themselves developed tactics specifically designed to take advantage of their Primarch's unique ability. Corax would infiltrate enemy positions alone, using his Wraith Slip to bypass defenses that would have stopped an entire army. Once inside the enemy perimeter, he would strike at key targets, commanders, communication hubs, power generation facilities. These surgical strikes would create confusion and disruption, and into that chaos, the Raven Guard would deploy in force, exploiting the openings their Primarch had created. This two-phase approach to warfare became the Raven Guard's signature during the Great Crusade. First came the Invisible Blade, Corax himself, dismantling enemy coordination and sowing panic. Then came the Swift Strike Forces, hitting hard while the enemy was still reeling from the loss of their leadership. By the time defenders could mount an organized response, the battle was already over, objectives secured, and the Raven Guard vanishing back into whatever shadows they'd emerged from. There's a particular account from the Compliance of Narcissus, where Corax demonstrated the full potential of his ability in ways that became legendary, even among his brother Primarchs. The planet's ruling military junta had fortified themselves in a massive citadel that was, by all conventional military analysis, unassailable. Its walls were hundreds of feet thick, its defensive turrets could track and eliminate anything that approached, and its command structure was buried so deep underground that even sustained orbital bombardment couldn't reach them. Corax studied the problem for 3 days, then simply walked in through the front gate. Using his Wraith Slip, he moved through hundreds of defenders without being detected once. He descended level by level through the citadel, his presence never registering on any of the hundreds of security systems. When he finally reached the command bunker, he materialized in front of the junta's leaders like a ghost made flesh. The accounts from the surviving defenders speak of the terror in that moment, of seeing their supposedly impregnable fortress violated by an opponent who simply shouldn't have been able to be there. Corax killed the junta leadership personally, using his lightning claws to ensure none could call for help or trigger any kind of dead man switch. Then he activated the Citadel's internal communication system and broadcast a simple message to the entire defending force. Their leaders were dead, resistance was over, and anyone who chose to continue fighting would be hunted down and eliminated. The defending army, faced with the reality that their most secure location had been penetrated by a single warrior, surrendered en masse. The entire operation, from the moment Corax entered the citadel to the moment he accepted the defenders' surrender, took less than an hour. Stories like this spread throughout the Great Crusade's armies, loyalist and enemy alike. The Raven Lord could be anywhere, could strike at any time, and no defense was reliable against him. Prudent commanders learned to sleep in different locations each night, to never maintain predictable patterns, to always assume that shadows might contain death incarnate. Yet even these precautions often proved insufficient. Corax was patient, and sooner or later, every pattern had an exception he could exploit. It's worth noting that Corax himself seemed to have mixed feelings about his Wraith Slip ability. He recognized its tactical value, understood how much it contributed to his legion's effectiveness, but there's evidence that he found the ability somewhat unsettling. Several accounts suggest he preferred, when possible, to fight openly rather than relying on stealth. Perhaps he saw in the Wraith Slip an echo of the invisibility he'd experienced as a slave, where being overlooked and forgotten was a defense mechanism born of powerlessness rather than strength. Regardless of his personal feelings, the Wraith Slip remained one of Corvus Corax's most devastating capabilities, a power that elevated him from merely being an exceptional warrior to being something that approached a living nightmare for his enemies. And this ability, already formidable in its original form, would later evolve into something far more powerful and far more disturbing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we must discuss the moment when all of Corax's abilities, all his tactical genius, all his carefully built legion, were put to the ultimate test. We must discuss the drop site massacre at Istvan V, the betrayal that would change Corvus Corax forever. The drop site massacre, betrayal at Istvan V. There are moments in history when the entire trajectory of civilizations shifts, when decisions made in the heat of battle ripple outward across millennia. For the Imperium of Man, for the Space Marine legions, and for Corvus Corax personally, that moment came on the black volcanic sand of Istvan V. What happened there would haunt Corax for the rest of his existence, would transform him from a confident commander into a warrior driven by guilt and vengeance in equal measure. The stage was set by the ultimate betrayal. Warmaster Horus, the Emperor's most favored son, the Primarch who had been chosen to lead the Great Crusade while the Emperor himself returned to Terra, had turned traitor. The exact details of his corruption remain a subject of sealed records and whispered speculation, but the result was clear. Horus had sworn himself to the Chaos Gods and was gathering forces for an assault on the Imperium itself. The first betrayal had occurred on Istvan III, where Horus had purged the loyalist elements from his own legion and those of several brother Primarchs through the simple expedient of virus bombing them while they were engaged in surface operations. Those who survived the immediate viral assault were then subjected to a sustained bombardment that turned the planet's surface into a hellscape of fire and ash. It was an atrocity that shocked even those who understood the brutal realities of war in the grim darkness of the far future. In response, the Imperium dispatched 7 full Space Marine legions to bring the traitors to heel. The Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders under Vulcan, and the Raven Guard under Corvus Corax formed the first wave. They would make a combat drop onto Istvan V to engage the traitor forces directly. Following behind them, ready to reinforce once the beachhead was established, came the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers, the Night Lords, and the Alpha Legion. It should have been an overwhelming force, 7 legions against the 4 that Horus had declared for. The mathematics of the situation seemed straightforward. Crush the traitors through superior numbers, capture Horus, and end the rebellion before it could truly begin. Even accounting for the difficulty of fighting against fellow Space Marines, the Loyalists had what appeared to be an insurmountable advantage. Corax approached the deployment with the same careful analysis he brought to every operation. He studied the terrain of Istvan V, noting its volcanic geography, the limited landing zones, the sight lines, and potential ambush points. He coordinated with his brother Primarchs, ensuring that the 3 legions' tactics would complement each other. The plan was straightforward. Establish a landing zone, push inland to engage the traitor forces, and hold until the second wave could reinforce them. The drop itself was contested, but not catastrophic. The traitor forces fired upon the incoming drop pods, but this was expected. Losses were within acceptable parameters, and the 3 legions managed to establish their beachhead successfully. Corax, leading from the front as was his preference, touched down with his first wave and immediately began directing the Raven Guard's deployment. And then the battle was joined. The initial engagement went as well as could be expected. The Loyalist forces pushed forward across the volcanic plains, engaging the traitor legions that had entrenched themselves in prepared positions. It was brutal work, the kind of grinding attrition warfare that Corax normally avoided. But the plan was to simply hold the traitors in place until the reinforcements arrived. Once the second wave landed, the numerical superiority would become overwhelming, and the traitors would be crushed between 2 armies. But as the battle raged on, as casualties mounted and the fighting reached a fever pitch, something felt wrong. Corax, with his enhanced perceptions and tactical awareness, began to notice anomalies. The traitor forces weren't fighting with the desperation of warriors who knew they were doomed. They were fighting with confidence, as if they knew something the Loyalists did not. Their positioning seemed designed not to prevent the Loyalists from establishing control, but to channel them, to herd them into specific locations. And then Corax saw him. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, one of the legions that was supposed to be part of the second wave, the reinforcements. He was here, on the battlefield, fighting alongside the traitors. The realization hit Corax like a physical blow. The second wave wasn't coming to reinforce the Loyalists. They were coming to complete the trap. What happened next has been described by the few survivors as a descent into hell. The second wave landed not to support the Loyalist legions, but to attack them from behind. 4 full Space Marine legions, all their guns and warriors, turned against brothers they were supposed to be helping. The Loyalists found themselves caught in a vice, traitor forces to their front, and supposed allies turned enemies at their back. The killing began in earnest. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, and arguably the most straightforward of the 3 Loyalist Primarchs present, refused to accept the reality of the situation. Enraged by the betrayal, he led a spearhead charge directly at the traitor positions, determined to reach Fulgrim, his erstwhile brother who had turned to chaos. It was a charge born of fury rather than tactics, and it was exactly what the traitors had been waiting for. Ferrus Manus was isolated, surrounded, and killed, his head taken as a trophy by Fulgrim himself. Vulcan disappeared into the chaos of battle, his legions scattered and fighting for survival. And Corvus Corax found himself leading what remained of the Raven Guard in a desperate fight simply to survive. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that Corax encountered Lorgar again, this time face to face. The Primarch of the Word-Bearers, the architect of so much of the corruption that had led to this moment, stood before the Raven Lord with a smile that spoke of supreme confidence. Lorgar, who had never been considered a particularly skilled warrior among the Primarchs, seemed to believe that Corax, exhausted from hours of sustained combat, would be easy prey. He was catastrophically wrong. Corax's attack was a thing of terrible beauty. His lightning claws flashed in patterns too fast for the eye to follow, each strike aimed with surgical precision at weak points in Lorgar's armor. The Word-Bearer's Primarch tried to mount a defense, tried to use his own considerable strength and his psychic abilities to turn the tide, but against Corax's speed and fury, he was hopelessly outmatched. Within moments, Corax had Lorgar on the defensive. Within a few more heartbeats, he had driven one of his lightning claws through Lorgar's torso, the energized talons punching through ceramite and flesh to impale the Word-Bearer. Lorgar's face showed shock, pain, and something that might have been fear as he realized he was about to die, that all his schemes and betrayals were about to end on the volcanic sands of Istvan V. Corax raised his claws for the killing blow, ready to remove Lorgar's head and end at least one of the traitor Primarchs. In that moment, weakened and exhausted as he was, the Raven Lord was about to achieve something that would have fundamentally altered the course of the heresy. Lorgar's death would have robbed the traitors of one of their key spiritual leaders, would have sent a message that betrayal carried consequences even for Primarchs. And then a shadow fell between them. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, master of the Night Lord's Legion, and perhaps the only Primarch who could match Corax for sheer terror-inducing presence, materialized as if from nowhere. He struck at Corax with a ferocity that surprised even the Raven Lord, forcing him to abandon his attack on Lorgar and defend himself against this new threat. In another circumstance, Corax might have been able to fight both Primarchs simultaneously, but he'd been fighting for hours, had expended enormous amounts of energy leading his legion through the nightmare of the betrayal, and was physically and mentally exhausted in ways that even a Primarch's superhuman endurance couldn't fully compensate for. Against 2 fresh opponents, even injured as Lorgar was, the mathematics of the situation were unfavorable. Corax made a decision that would haunt him for millennia. He disengaged, using his superior speed and his jump pack to withdraw from the melee. As he pulled back, he saw Lorgar being dragged to safety by Wordbearer's warriors, saw the wound he'd inflicted already beginning to heal through warp-enhanced regeneration. The traitor Primarch would survive, would go on to cause untold suffering across the galaxy, and it was because Corax had failed to finish what he'd started. But there was no time for regret. Not yet. The Raven Guard were scattered across the battlefield, pockets of resistance fighting desperately against impossible odds. Corax needed to gather what remained of his legion, needed to find some way to extract them from this catastrophe before they were completely annihilated. For 98 days, Corvus Corax fought a guerrilla campaign on Istvan V. The very tactics he'd perfected during his youth on Lycaeus, the hit-and-run warfare that had defined the Raven Guard's approach to combat, now became the only thing keeping his legion alive. They struck from shadows, ambushed isolated enemy units, destroyed supply lines, and vanished before the traitors could mount an effective response. But they were trapped, surrounded by 7 full traitor legions, hunted across the volcanic wastes with nowhere to run. Corax watched his sons die one by one, saw the legion he'd built and trained and led for decades systematically destroyed by enemies who had once been brothers. The survivors were pushed beyond the limits of even Space Marine endurance, fighting while wounded, while starving, while exhausted beyond the point where humans should have been capable of any action at all. Salvation came in an unexpected form. Captain Brananev, who had been left on deliverance as part of the garrison force, had begun experiencing strange dreams. The Therion cohort's commander, Prefector Marcus Valerius, had visions of the disaster at Istvan V, psychic impressions of the desperate situation his Primarch faced. Acting on these visions, against all logic and protocol, Bran gathered what ships he could and launched a rescue mission. The extraction was a desperate affair. The Raven Guard, reduced to perhaps 3,000 Marines from the tens of thousands who had deployed to Istvan V, fought their way to the extraction points while traitor forces closed in from all sides. Many died in those final moments, sacrificing themselves to buy time for their brothers to reach the ships. Corax himself was among the last to board, maintaining a rearguard action until the final transport lifted off. As the surviving Raven Guard ships broke through the traitor blockade and fled into the warp, Corvus Corax stood on the bridge of the Avenger and surveyed what remained of his legion. 3,000 survivors out of 80,000 deployed. The Raven Guard, one of the most effective legions in the Imperium's arsenal, had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength in a single battle. And the Horus Heresy, that galaxy-spanning civil war that would bring the Imperium to its knees, had only just begun. The psychological impact of Istvan V on Corax cannot be overstated. He had failed. He had led his legion into a trap, had been unable to prevent their near destruction, had let Lorgar escape when he'd had the chance to end at least one traitor's existence. The guilt weighed on him like physical chains, transforming the confident, strategic Primarch into someone harder, more driven, consumed by the twin needs to rebuild his shattered legion and to make the traitors pay for their betrayal. What remained of the Raven Guard's command structure gathered in the aftermath, trying to make sense of what had happened. How had the traitors kept their second betrayal secret? How had 7 Primarchs coordinated such a massive deception without any warning reaching the Loyalists? The scale of the planning and coordination required suggested that the corruption ran far deeper than anyone had suspected, that the heresy wasn't a sudden impulse, but something that had been carefully orchestrated over years or even decades. But understanding the betrayal didn't change the fundamental problem Corax faced. The Raven Guard were crippled, unable to contribute meaningfully to the defense of the Imperium against the traitor forces. With the numbers they had left, they could perhaps conduct small-scale operations, raids, and sabotage missions. But they couldn't engage in the kind of warfare that would be needed to turn the tide of the heresy. And so, with the bitter taste of defeat still fresh and the guilt of failure weighing on his soul, Corvus Corax made a decision that would have consequences reaching far beyond anything he could have anticipated. He decided to rebuild the Raven Guard, no matter the cost. He decided to create the Raptors, The Raptor Project. Desperate measures. In the desperate aftermath of Istvan V, with the Horus heresy spreading like wildfire across the galaxy, Corvus Corax faced an impossible situation. The Raven Guard, once 80,000 strong and one of the most effective legions in the Imperium's arsenal, had been reduced to perhaps 3,000 functional warriors. Traditional Space Marine recruitment and training took years, sometimes decades, to produce fully capable warriors. At that pace, the Raven Guard would remain militarily irrelevant for the duration of the war, unable to contribute to the defense of the Imperium they had sworn to protect. For a Primarch like Corax, who measured himself by his effectiveness as a warrior and commander, this forced irrelevance was almost worse than death. He had survived when many of his sons had not. He had escaped Istvan V, while tens of thousands of Raven Guard lay dead on its volcanic sands. The weight of that survival demanded that he make their sacrifice meaningful, that he find some way to return the Legion to fighting strength so that the traitors would pay for what they had done. There was only one potential solution, but it was one that had been deliberately sealed away, locked behind prohibitions so dire that only a Primarch or the Emperor himself could bypass them. During the earliest days of the Space Marine project, during the frantic period when the Emperor had been conquering Terra and needed armies capable of fighting enhanced humans and Xenos threats, accelerated gene seed implantation techniques had been developed. These methods could create Space Marines in a fraction of the normal time, could turn raw recruits into fully functional warriors in mere weeks rather than years. But there had been a reason those techniques were sealed away: warnings about the consequences of rushing the implantation process. The human body, even enhanced as it is during the creation of a Space Marine, needs time to adapt to each successive organ implant, needs time to integrate the genetic modifications that transform a baseline human into an Astartes. Rushing that process risked catastrophic failure, mutations, rejection, and madness. The decision Corax faced was simple in its cruelty: accept the Raven Guard's irrelevance, or risk unknown consequences to restore his legion's fighting strength. For a Primarch who had seen his sons die by the thousands, who carried the guilt of their deaths with every breath, there was really only one choice he could make. Corax returned to Terra and sought an audience with the Emperor. The master of mankind, still engaged in his own mysterious work beneath the Imperial Palace, received his son but did not emerge from his labors. Instead, through methods that were never fully explained, the Emperor allowed Corax access to sealed knowledge, to the location of a hidden laboratory that contained the genetic secrets of the Primarchs themselves. But accessing this knowledge came with a test. The laboratory was protected by something called the Labyrinth, a security system so sophisticated that even a Primarch couldn't simply bypass it through force or technical skill. Corax had to navigate the labyrinth using his own abilities, his intelligence, and his understanding of his father's nature. The Emperor, in his way, was testing whether Corax was truly ready for the knowledge he sought, whether he understood the implications of what he was asking for. Corax succeeded where perhaps no other Primarch could have. His analytical mind, capable of processing tactical data at superhuman speeds, allowed him to see patterns in the labyrinth's structure. His stealth abilities, the wraith slip that made him effectively invisible, allowed him to bypass security measures designed to detect any intrusion. Most crucially, his understanding of his own nature as a Primarch, his insight into how the Emperor had crafted each of his sons for specific purposes, gave him clues that a less introspective warrior might have missed. In the heart of the labyrinth, Corax found what he sought: the pure Primarch genome, the base genetic code from which the Emperor had crafted each of his 20 sons. This wasn't the specialized gene seed that defined each legion, but the foundation upon which all Primarchs were built. With this knowledge, Corax believed he could create a variant of Raven Guard gene seed that would work with the accelerated implantation process, that would allow rapid creation of new Space Marines without the catastrophic failures that had made the technique unusable. Before he could depart Terra with this precious knowledge, Corax was asked by Malcador, the Sigillite, to participate in another mission, a raid on the traitor-occupied forges of Mars. The Peditum incursion, as it would later be called, was a desperate gambit to deny the traitors access to crucial technology and manufacturing capabilities. Corax agreed, seeing an opportunity to strike back at the forces that had betrayed his legion at Istvan V. The mission was an ambush, a trap laid by the traitor forces under Lucas Krom. But Corax had learned from Istvan V. He'd learned to trust nothing, to assume every situation might be a deception. His paranoia and caution allowed him and most of the loyalist forces to escape, though the mission itself was largely a failure. The traitors maintained their hold on the Martian forges, and the Imperium lost valuable warriors in the attempt. Returning to Deliverance with the precious gene tech, Corax immediately set his chief apothecary, Vincente VI, to work on implementing the accelerated implantation program. The process required careful integration of the base Primarch genome with the specific Raven Guard gene seed, creating a hybrid that would, in theory, allow for rapid space marine creation without the stability issues that had plagued earlier attempts. The initial results were extraordinary. The first generation of what Corax called Raptors showed enhanced capabilities even beyond standard space marines. They were faster, stronger, more intelligent, with reflexes and combat abilities that approached what the Primarch had originally envisioned for his legion. Within weeks, Corax had created hundreds of new warriors, the beginning of what he hoped would be the rebuilt Raven Guard. But shadows lurked within this apparent success, shadows that wore the face of brothers. The Alpha Legion, the most mysterious and secretive of all the Space Marine legions, had deployed what might have been their greatest deception. During the chaos of Istvan V, Alpha Legion operatives had infiltrated the Raven Guard, posing as loyalists who had become separated from their own legion. These infiltrators were perfect mimics, their gene seed altered to pass even the most stringent examination. They integrated themselves into the Raven Guard's command structure, gaining positions of trust, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Corax began the Raptor project. The Alpha Legion infiltrators, led by operatives whose names would never be fully known, worked with a renegade Mechanicum Magos named Unithrax. Together, they carried out an act of sabotage so subtle, so insidious, that it wasn't detected until it was far too late to prevent. They corrupted the pure Primarch genome with demon blood. The corruption was molecular, invisible to standard genetic analysis. The tainted genome was mixed with the gene seed being used to create new raptors, and the mutation-inducing properties of the demonic taint didn't manifest immediately. For several weeks, everything seemed to be proceeding perfectly. Hundreds of new raptors were created, each appearing to be exactly what Corax had hoped for. Superior warriors who would help restore the Raven Guard to its former glory. And then the mutations began. It started with minor physical changes. A raptor would develop scales where there should have been skin. Another would grow additional bone protrusions. But these early mutations were just the beginning. As the weeks passed, the changes became more dramatic, more horrifying. Raptors grew extra limbs, developed fangs and claws, exhibited characteristics that no human, no space marine, should possess. Their faces twisted into monstrous configurations, their bodies warped into forms that were as much demon as human. The worst part was that they remained conscious, remained aware of what was happening to them. They weren't mindless beasts, but thinking, feeling warriors who found themselves trapped in bodies that were becoming less human with each passing day. They could see the horror in their brothers' eyes, could understand that they had become monsters. Abominations that violated everything the Space Marines were supposed to represent. For Corvus Corax, the discovery of the mutations and the Alpha Legion infiltration was a betrayal that cut deeper than even Istvan V. He had sought to rebuild his legion, to make his son's sacrifice meaningful, and instead, he had created monsters. These warriors, who had volunteered to become Space Marines, who had placed their trust in their Primarch, had been transformed into creatures that couldn't even be recognized as human anymore. The response had to be swift and absolute. Corax ordered the Raptor program terminated immediately. Every Alpha Legion infiltrator who could be identified was executed without hesitation. Unithrax and his renegade Mechanicum forces were hunted down and eliminated. But these actions, necessary as they were, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The question of what to do with the mutated raptors was perhaps the most agonizing decision Corax had ever faced. These warriors were victims, not villains. They had done nothing wrong except volunteer to serve their legion. The mutations weren't their fault. They were the result of sabotage by enemies who had struck at the Raven Guard in the most insidious way possible. Some argued that the mutated raptors should be mercy killed, that their continued existence was a cruelty and a security risk. But Corax, remembering his own origins as a slave, as someone who had been deemed less than human by those who held power over him, couldn't bring himself to condemn these warriors simply for what had been done to them. Instead, he made a different decision. The mutated raptors, who retained their sanity, who could still function as warriors despite their physical changes, would be allowed to fight. They would serve as a separate unit, deployed to the most desperate situations where their particular talents, their berserker fury, and inhuman strength could be used to maximum effect. It was, in its own way, a mercy, allowing them to die as warriors rather than being executed as mistakes. But the psychological toll on Corax was immense. The Raptor project had been his great hope, his chance to rebuild what Istvan V had destroyed. Instead, it had become yet another failure, another weight of guilt that he would carry forward. The young Raptors, who hadn't been corrupted, remained as part of the Legion, slowly trained through more traditional methods. But they served as a constant reminder of what had almost been, of the disaster that had been narrowly averted. In the wake of the Raptor project's failure, Corax withdrew somewhat from the wider war. The Raven Guard continued to fight, conducting raids and operations where their reduced numbers could still make a difference. But they never regained the strength they'd had before Istvan V. They saved the Space Wolves from destruction during the Battle of Yarant, participated in the Lion's Crusade of Vengeance, and generally conducted themselves with honor and skill. But Corax himself was changed. The confident, strategic Primarch who had entered the heresy, believing in the righteousness of his cause and the inevitability of victory, had been replaced by someone harder, darker, more driven by guilt than by hope. He had failed his legion twice now, first at Istvan V, then with the Raptor project. Each failure added another layer to the weight he carried, another voice to the ones that whispered in his mind about inadequacy and responsibility. After the Siege of Terra, after Horus was finally defeated and the Imperium began the long process of rebuilding, Corax faced yet another bitter decision. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who had survived the heresy largely intact and was now setting about restructuring the Space Marine legions, demanded that the legions be divided. The Codex Astartes he was developing called for breaking the massive legions into smaller chapters, preventing any single commander from wielding the kind of power that had made Horus's betrayal possible. For Corax, whose legion had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength, this division felt like a final insult. The Raven Guard would be split into multiple chapters, their collective identity fractured, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. Worse still, the question of what to do with the surviving mutated raptors remained unresolved. Corax made the decision himself. In a ceremony that some described as an execution and others as a mercy, the mutated raptors were subjected to the Emperor's judgment. Whether they were actually killed or given the Emperor's peace through some other means remains unclear. But what is certain is that after that ceremony, they were gone. Their existence wiped from the official records as if they had never been. And then, exactly 1 year after the division of the legions, Corvus Corax walked into his chambers in the Raven Spire and locked the door. For a full year, he remained in isolation, speaking to no one, accepting no visitors. What he did during that year, what thoughts occupied his mind, remain unknown. But when he finally emerged, he announced his intentions to his remaining sons. He was leaving. He was going into the Eye of Terror, into the realm of chaos itself, to hunt the traitors who had destroyed his legion and betrayed everything the Imperium stood for. He was going to find Lorgar, the word-bearer he had nearly killed on Istvan V, and this time there would be no interruption, no escape. The sons of Corax begged him to reconsider, argued that the Raven Guard needed their Primarch, that he shouldn't throw his life away on what might be a suicide mission. But Corax's mind was made. He had failed too many times, carried too much guilt. The only way forward he could see was through vengeance, through making the traitors pay for what they had done. And so Corvus Corax, the Raven Lord, the Deliverer, the Primarch of the 19th Legion, walked away from everything he had built, everyone who loved him, and disappeared into the warp. It would be 10,000 years before anyone heard from him again, and when he did resurface, he would be changed in ways that even his worst nightmares couldn't have predicted. Combat feats and Primarch comparisons. To truly understand how strong Corvus Corax is, we must examine his actual combat performance against other Primarchs and significant enemies. While theoretical capabilities and designed specifications tell us what a warrior should be capable of, it's in the heat of battle, when facing opponents of equal or greater power, that true strength reveals itself. Corax's combat record provides fascinating insight into both his capabilities and his tactical philosophy. Let us begin with the most significant engagement we have detailed records of: his fight with Lorgar Aurelian during the Drop Site Massacre. Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, has never been considered one of the more martially inclined of the Emperor's sons. Where Primarchs like Angron or Russ built their entire identity around being warriors first and foremost, Lorgar was primarily a scholar, a philosopher, and a religious leader who happened to possess the physical capabilities of a Primarch. Yet even accounting for Lorgar's relative lack of martial focus, the speed and completeness with which Corax dominated him is remarkable. Contemporary accounts describe the fight lasting perhaps 2 minutes from first contact to Corax driving his lightning claw through Lorgar's torso. 2 minutes, against another Primarch. This wasn't a technical match where both warriors probed each other's defenses. It was a brutal dismantling where Corax's superior speed, reflexes, and combat skills simply overwhelmed his opponent. Lorgar attempted to use his psychic abilities during the engagement, trying to leverage his connection to the warp to gain an advantage. But Corax's attacks came too fast, too relentlessly. The Word-Bearer couldn't concentrate enough to manifest his full powers, couldn't create the space needed to bring his strength to bear. By the time Lorgar realized how badly outmatched he was, Corax already had him impaled, already raising his claws for the killing strike that would have removed the traitor's head. Only Konrad Kurz's intervention saved Lorgar's life, and this introduces another important data point in assessing Corax's combat capabilities. The fact that Kurzi felt it necessary to intervene, that he didn't trust Lorgar to handle Corax even with assistance, speaks volumes about how the Night Haunter assessed the situation. Kurzi himself was no mean warrior, and his combat record includes impressive victories against other Primarchs. Yet he recognized that Corax, even exhausted from hours of sustained combat, represented a serious threat. The fight that followed between Corax and Kurz wasn't conclusive. Corax withdrew, rather than risk being trapped between two opponents. But several accounts from that engagement note that Corax held his own quite well, despite his exhaustion and the fact that he'd just been fighting through a massacre that had claimed most of his legion. The withdrawal wasn't a defeat, but a tactical decision, the same kind of pragmatic choice that had defined Corax's approach to warfare throughout his existence. It's worth noting what this fight tells us about Corax's combat philosophy. Another Primarch, Perhaps one like Angron or even Russ might have stayed to fight both opponents despite the unfavorable odds, trusting in fury or determination to see them through. Corax instead made the cold calculation that even if he could defeat both Lorgar and Kersey, which was far from certain given his condition, doing so would likely cost him his life, and definitely would cost more Raven Guard their lives, as he wasn't available to command and coordinate their escape. The decision to withdraw rather than pursue vengeance, to accept that Lorgar would live so that more of his sons might survive, demonstrates a kind of strength that's perhaps more impressive than simply winning the fight would have been. It's the strength of a leader who puts his legion's survival above his own desire for retribution. But let us consider Corax's combat capabilities in other contexts. His fighting style, as described in various accounts, emphasized speed and precision over raw power. While Primarchs like Vulcan might win fights through sheer physical strength, simply overpowering opponents through superior force, Corax won through surgical strikes at vulnerable points. His lightning claws weren't wielded with brutal force, but with almost surgical precision, each strike aimed at joints, at weak points in armor, at locations where even a Primarch's enhanced durability couldn't fully protect. This fighting style is perhaps best demonstrated in an account from earlier in the Great Crusade, during the compliance of Garland Delta. Corax found himself facing an alien warlord who stood perhaps 15 feet tall, a Xenos creature that possessed 4 arms, natural armor plating, and reflexes that approached Space Marine levels. By all accounts, this creature should have been a challenging opponent, even for a Primarch. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds. Corax used his jump pack to gain altitude, activating his Wraith Slip in mid-air so the creature lost track of him. Then he struck from above, his lightning claws severing 2 of the creature's arms before it could even register the attack. As the Xenos warlord stumbled, trying to comprehend how it had just lost half its limbs, Corax landed, rolled, and came up slashing, his claws removing the creature's legs at the knee joints. The entire engagement was over before the Xenos even understood what had happened. This exemplifies Corax's approach to combat. Why engage in a prolonged duel when you can use mobility, stealth, and superior positioning to end the fight before it truly begins? Other Primarchs might have chosen to face the Xenos warlord head-on, to prove their strength through direct confrontation. Corax simply killed it in the most efficient way possible and moved on to the next objective. When comparing Corax to his brother Primarchs in terms of pure combat capability, we must be careful to define what we mean by combat capability. If we're measuring raw physical strength, Primarchs like Vulcan or the Emperor's Primarch Magnus the Red likely surpass Corax. If we're measuring psychic power, Magnus and Lorgar would rank above him. If we're measuring sustained combat ability, the sheer capacity to keep fighting through injuries and exhaustion, Primarchs like Angron or Perturabo might have the edge. But if we're measuring lethality, the pure efficiency with which a Primarch can eliminate opponents, Corax ranks among the very highest. His combination of speed, precision, and tactical acumen made him one of the deadliest Primarchs in single combat, particularly when he could leverage his stealth abilities to dictate the terms of engagement. Several accounts place Corax's pure combat speed as comparable to Horus himself, who was widely considered among the fastest of the Primarchs. There are records of sparring matches between the two where observers had difficulty following the exchanges, where the speed of their movements created after-images that confused even Space Marine visual processing. When speed is your primary advantage, being comparable to the War Master himself is high praise indeed. Yet Corax's combat record also reveals his weaknesses. Against opponents who could negate his speed advantage, who could match his reflexes or predict his movements, he had more difficulty. Konrad Kurz's precognitive abilities allowed him to partially counter Corax's superior speed by knowing where he would strike before the attack came. Similarly, Primarchs like Fulgrim, who had enhanced their already considerable abilities through chaos corruption, could present challenges that Corax's standard tactics struggled against. There's also evidence that Corax's combat effectiveness was somewhat dependent on his psychological state. When he was focused, calm, and thinking tactically, he was extraordinarily dangerous. But when he was angry or emotionally compromised, some of that efficiency degraded. This isn't surprising. Emotional control is crucial for any warrior, but particularly for one whose fighting style depends on precision and calculation rather than raw fury. The accounts we have of Corax fighting non-Primarch opponents are almost anticlimactic in their one-sidedness. Regular Space Marines, even Traitor Marines, stood essentially no chance against him in single combat. There are accounts of Corax fighting through entire squads of Chaos Space Marines, his claws and weapons ending lives so quickly that the enemy didn't have time to mount coordinated attacks. Against normal humans or lesser Xenos, Corax was simply a force of nature, an unstoppable killing machine that moved too fast to be targeted and struck too hard to be survived. One particularly vivid account from the Heresy describes Corax infiltrating a word-bearer's stronghold alone. Over the course of perhaps 3 hours, moving through the fortress using his wraith slip to remain undetected, he killed 43 word-bearers, including 2 captains and a chaplain. The word-bearers knew they were being hunted, knew there was an enemy in their stronghold, but they couldn't find him, couldn't predict where he would strike next. By the time Corax revealed himself and withdrew, the entire command structure of the fortress had been decapitated, and the surviving defenders were too psychologically shattered to mount an effective defense when the main Raven Guard force attacked hours later. This kind of operation showcases what makes Corax truly dangerous. It's not just his combat capabilities in a straight fight, impressive as those are, but his ability to leverage those capabilities through tactics and planning that create situations where he has overwhelming advantages. Any warrior can be dangerous in a fair fight, but Corax specialized in ensuring fights were never fair, that he always held the initiative, always struck from unexpected angles, always had the advantages he needed to ensure victory. When ranking the Primarchs by combat effectiveness, lists inevitably vary depending on who's creating them and what criteria they prioritize. But most analyses place Corax solidly in the upper third, typically ranked somewhere between 7th and 10th among the 18. We don't discuss the missing 2. Primarchs like Horus, Sanguinius, the Lion, and probably Russ are generally considered superior in direct combat. But Corax often ranks alongside or above Primarchs like Guilliman, Perturabo, and certainly above scholars like Lorgar. More importantly, in the specific domain of assassination, infiltration, and decapitation strikes, Corax had essentially no equal among his brothers. While Curzi might rival him in inspiring terror, and Alfarius might match him in subtlety, no Primarch combined Corax's stealth capabilities with his combat effectiveness to quite the same degree. Yet all of this analysis, all these comparisons and combat records describe Corvus Corax as he was during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. They describe a Primarch at the height of his engineered capabilities, a warrior who was exactly what the Emperor intended him to be. What they don't describe, what we haven't yet addressed, is what Corvus Corax became after he disappeared into the Eye of Terror. Because the Raven Lord who vanished into the warp 10,000 years ago is not the same being that emerged to hunt the traitors in the realm of chaos. Time and exposure to the warp transformed Corax into something that transcends the limitations of his original design, something that perhaps even the Emperor didn't anticipate when he created his 19 sons. Into the Eye of Terror, the Hunter becomes legend. The records of what happened after Corvus Corax entered the Eye of Terror are fragmentary at best. The Eye of Terror is a region of space where reality itself breaks down, where the immaterium bleeds through into the physical universe, creating a hellscape where the laws of physics are mere suggestions and time flows in ways that defy mortal comprehension. Information that escapes the eye is unreliable, filtered through the perceptions of beings driven mad by what they've witnessed or corrupted by the very forces that make the eye what it is. Yet we can piece together certain elements of Corax's journey from the scattered accounts that have emerged over the 10 millennia since his departure. We know that he went seeking the traitor Primarchs, particularly Lorgar, the word-bearer who had escaped death at Istvan V. We know that he didn't immediately find them, that his hunt would span centuries, perhaps even millennia, given time's fluid nature within the warp. And we know that during this hunt, Corax himself was changed by exposure to the very realm he was traversing. The Eye of Terror is not a place where physical beings can survive unchanged. The warp energy that permeates every inch of that accursed space seeks to corrupt, to mutate, to transform anything of the material realm into something that better reflects the chaotic nature of the Imperium. Chaos Space Marines who dwell in the Eye maintain their physical forms only through the protection of their patron gods, and even then, they inevitably change, acquiring mutations and alterations that mark them as servants of chaos. But Corax was no ordinary being. He was a Primarch, a creature woven from the Emperor's own genetic material and infused with power that came directly from the master of mankind. The Primarchs were designed to resist warp corruption, to stand against the temptations and alterations that would overwhelm lesser beings. Yet even this resistance has its limits, and Corax was walking directly into the heart of Chaos's power, surrounded by energies that sought to unmake him or remake him in their own image. What protected Corax during those early years in the Eye remains a matter of speculation. Some scholars suggest that his Wraith Slip ability, his capacity to edit himself out of local reality, somehow extended to protecting him from the worst of the warp's influence. By remaining partially invisible even to the Chaos Gods themselves, he could navigate their realm without fully exposing himself to their corrupting touch. Others argue that his sheer force of will, his single-minded focus on hunting the traitors, created a kind of protective barrier that the warp couldn't fully penetrate. But protection from corruption and being unchanged by the warp are two very different things. As the centuries passed, as Corax hunted through demon worlds and fought battles in realms where reality itself was negotiable, he began to change. Not in the way that Chaos Space Marines change, not through the deliberate acceptance of Chaos's gifts and the corruption that comes with them. Instead, Corax began to evolve, his already formidable abilities expanding and transforming in ways that drew on the warp's power without accepting the warp's ownership. The first solid account we have of this transformation comes from a word-bearer's demon world called Sicarus. This planet served as one of the word-bearer's primary strongholds in the Eye of Terror, a place where reality had been completely subordinated to the will of chaos. Here, monuments to the dark gods rose thousands of feet into a perpetually twilight sky, and the very ground was soaked in the blood of countless sacrifices. The word-bearers who dwelt there believed themselves safe, protected by their gods and surrounded by the full might of their legion. They were wrong. The first anyone knew of Corax's presence was when a patrol of word-bearers simply disappeared. One moment, they were walking their appointed route. The next, they were gone, as if reality itself had erased them. Then another patrol vanished. Then a guard post went silent. And then bodies began appearing. Word-bearers torn apart with a savagery that suggested something far more powerful than any normal attacker. The word-bearers, veterans of 10,000 years of warfare in the Eye of Terror, recognized that they were being hunted. They assumed a demon had somehow gained access to their world, perhaps some independent entity that had slipped through their wards and defenses. The Dark Apostles, the leadership caste of the Word-Bearers Legion, convened to discuss how to identify and banish this threat. And then the darkness came alive. The accounts from survivors, later extracted through divination and ritual before they were executed as failures, describe something that challenged their understanding of reality. Shadows moved independently of any light source, coalescing into forms that seemed simultaneously solid and immaterial. These shadows struck with claws that could tear through ceramite armor as easily as flesh, could kill with a touch, could appear and disappear in the blink of an eye. At first, the word-bearers tried to fight back using conventional means. They brought their bolters to bear, tried to track and target whatever was attacking them. But how do you shoot shadows? How do you fight an enemy that seems to exist in multiple places simultaneously, that can scatter into a flock of ravens and then reform behind you, already striking before you can turn? The losses mounted. Squads of word-bearers, veterans of the Long War who had fought against the Imperium for 10 millennia, were systematically eliminated. The Dark Apostles tried summoning demons to fight this shadow creature, tried using their psychic powers to banish it, tried every tool and technique they had accumulated over their long existence in service to chaos. Nothing worked. The hunter continued its work, relentless, patient, seemingly impossible to stop or even slow down. It was then that one of the word-bearers, a veteran who had fought at Istvan V all those millennia ago, recognized the fighting style, the preference for striking from shadows, the surgical precision of the kills, the way the attackers seemed to target leaders and key personnel rather than engaging in random slaughter. This wasn't a demon's hunting pattern. This was the Raven Guard's tactical approach, elevated to a level that transcended mortality. This was Corvus Corax. The revelation sent shockwaves through the word-bearer's command structure. The Raven Lord, who they had assumed died millennia ago or had given up his hunt, was here, on Sycharis, systematically dismantling their defenses. And he had become something far more dangerous than the Primarch they had fought against during the heresy. This wasn't just a warrior using advanced technology and training. This was something that had evolved, that had adapted to the Eye of Terror's environment, and had somehow done so without falling to chaos corruption. The word-bearers sent increasingly desperate messages to their Primarch, to Lorgar Aurelian himself. Their world was under attack by an entity they couldn't fight, couldn't banish, could barely understand. They needed their Primarch's intervention, needed his power as a demon prince to combat this threat that conventional means couldn't touch. And Lorgar, after centuries or millennia of hiding in his temple on Sycharis, preparing rituals and consolidating his power, finally emerged to face the hunter who had pursued him across time and space. Warp transformation, the avatar of darkness. The confrontation between Corvus Corax and Lorgar Aurelian on Sycharis marks one of the most significant events in post-heresy history, though much of it remains known only through fragmentary accounts and the testimony of word-bearers who witnessed the battle before their own demise. What makes this encounter so crucial is that it's the first time we see Corvus Corax after his transformation, the first moment when the galaxy got a glimpse of what the Raven Lord had become. Lorgar had ascended to Demon Prince status during the 10 millennia since the heresy. He had embraced chaos undivided, had given himself fully to the dark gods, and in return, he had been granted powers that transcended his original Primarch capabilities. He could manipulate reality through sheer will, could summon demons with a thought, could manifest psychic powers that would have made even Magnus the Red take notice. In theory, he should have been vastly more powerful than he had been during the heresy, far beyond the capabilities of the Primarch who had nearly killed him at Istvan V. But Corvus Corax had changed too, in ways that perhaps ran even deeper than Lorgar's demonic transformation. The confrontation began with the Dark Apostle Kal'Ta'ar leading a group of word-bearers to hunt down what they believed was a demon infiltrator. They moved through one of Sycharis's outer shrines, a massive structure dedicated to the dark gods, its walls covered in blasphemous scripture and stained with the blood of countless sacrifices. The hunt had been going poorly. Whatever they were tracking seemed to anticipate their every move, to know where they would be before they arrived. And then they saw it. A figure materialized from the shadows, a towering form clad in black armor, its face pale as death, its eyes dark as the void between stars. But this was no simple manifestation of a physical being. The figure seemed to exist on multiple planes simultaneously. partly solid, partly shadow, partly something else entirely. Ravens, dozens or perhaps hundreds of them, swirled around the figure, their calls echoing through the shrine like the screams of the damned. Kaltar recognized the figure immediately, despite its impossible nature. This was Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, but transformed into something that defied easy categorization. Was he a demon? Had he fallen to chaos like so many of his brothers? The Dark Apostle prepared to attack, assuming that this was simply another fallen Primarch, another tool of the Dark Gods. But before the word-bearers could strike, Corax moved, or rather, the concept of movement became irrelevant. One moment he was standing before them, the next, he was among them, his claws, now seemingly forged from living shadow rather than metal, tearing through ceramite and flesh with equal ease. Word-bearers, veterans of 10,000 years of war, died so quickly that their enhanced reflexes couldn't even register the attacks. Corax wasn't just fast. He was operating on a different timescale, existing in multiple places simultaneously, striking from angles that shouldn't have been possible. Those who survived the initial assault, scattered and terrified, tried to mount some kind of defense. They called upon the Dark Gods for protection, tried to use their own corrupted psychic abilities to fight back. But Corax seemed immune to their powers, as if he existed partially outside the reality that their abilities could affect. When they shot at him, the bolter rounds passed through shadows that might or might not have been the actual Ravenlord. When they tried to close with him in melee, they found themselves fighting darkness that could become solid claws and then dissolve back into shadow in an instant. And then Lorgar arrived. The demon Primarch manifested through a warp portal, his form towering even over normal Primarchs, wreathed in eldritch energies that marked him as something far removed from his original nature. His face bore scars that had never healed, remnants of the wounds Corax had inflicted at Istvan V all those millennia ago. The sight of those scars brought home a crucial point. Demon Primarchs could regenerate from almost any injury, could reshape their warp-stuff forms at will. Yet Lorgar had chosen to keep the scars as a reminder, perhaps as a source of rage and hatred toward his brother. Corax, seeing Lorgar emerge from his portal, reformed from his shadow form into something resembling his original Primarch body. But even in this more solid state, he remained something other than what he had once been. His armor seemed to be woven from living darkness. His wings, still bearing a resemblance to the Corvidine pinions he had worn during the Crusade, now looked more like they were formed from shadow and warp energy than metal and ceramite. Most disturbing of all were his hands, which ended not in his traditional lightning claws, but in talons that seemed to be extensions of his very being, weapons that were part of him rather than external tools. "This is no demon," Lorgar said, his voice carrying the weight of his demonic power. His statement was both observation and warning to his word-bearers. Whatever Corax had become, he wasn't simply another chaos-corrupted entity. He was something else, something that existed in a category all its own. The conversation that followed revealed much about Corax's transformation and his current state. "I have ascended," Lorgar claimed, gesturing to his demonic form as if expecting admiration or fear from his brother. "I am what I always have been," Corax replied, his voice carrying undertones that seemed to echo from multiple directions simultaneously. "I am vengeance incarnate. I am justice delivered. This place, beyond the veil, has revealed what we all are. Underneath the veneer of humanity our Father crafted for us. We are of the warp." This statement is perhaps the key to understanding what had happened to Corvus Corax. He hadn't fallen to chaos in the traditional sense, hadn't pledged himself to any dark god, or accepted corruption in exchange for power. Instead, he had discovered something about the fundamental nature of the Primarchs themselves. They were beings created through the Emperor's mastery of the warp, entities that existed partially outside normal reality, even in their original forms. By immersing himself in the Eye of Terror, by refusing to accept Chaos's ownership, while simultaneously embracing his own warp-touched nature, Corax had undergone a transformation that was somehow orthogonal to both loyalty and corruption. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Wordbearers had ever witnessed. Lorgar, with his demonic powers, summoned meteoric sigils, manifestations of warp energy that should have annihilated anything they touched. Corax simply dissolved into shadow and reformed elsewhere, untouched. When Lorgar tried to use his psychic abilities to pin Corax in place, to force him into a form that could be struck, the Raven Lord scattered into a flock of ravens that swarmed around the demon Primarch, pecking and clawing with beaks and talons that somehow drew blood from a being made of warp stuff. But Corax's attacks weren't merely physical. The Wordbearers who witnessed the battle later testified, before their executions, that when Corax's claws struck Lorgar, they seemed to damage not just the demon Primarch's physical form, but something deeper. Lorgar bled scripture, actual words of power flowing from his wounds like blood, a sign that Corax was somehow harming his fundamental nature rather than just his manifested body. This is significant because demon Primarchs are notoriously difficult to truly harm. Their bodies are constructs of warp energy, capable of rapid regeneration and reformation. Physical damage, even from weapons that could kill normal Primarchs, is largely inconsequential. The demon Primarch simply reconstitutes itself from the raw stuff of the warp. But Corax's attacks seem to bypass this defense. His claws, forged from his own transformed essence, struck at the spiritual level, creating wounds that Lorgar's demonic nature couldn't simply heal. The fight raged through the shrine and beyond, two beings that transcended normal understanding of power and reality, each trying to overcome the other through means that defied conventional physics. Lorgar tried to use his mastery of chaos to overwhelm Corax, to drown him in raw warp energy. Corax responded by becoming that energy, by existing as darkness and shadow that couldn't be dispersed or destroyed because it wasn't truly physical in the first place. For the first time in 10,000 years, Lorgar found himself outmatched. The brother he had dismissed as merely a skilled tactician during the heresy, the Primarch he had assumed died or gave up after disappearing into the eye, had returned as something far more dangerous than he had ever been. Worse still, Lorgar was discovering that his demon prince status, which he had spent millennia achieving and which should have made him functionally immortal, was providing far less protection than he had believed. As the battle turned increasingly against him, as Corax's relentless assault continued to inflict wounds that actually hurt, that continued to damage him in ways that he couldn't simply regenerate through, Lorgar made a decision. He retreated. Using his control over the warp, he opened a portal back to his innermost sanctum, his personal domain within Sycharis, where he had spent centuries or millennia in contemplation and ritual. Corax pursued, but the portal was closing, and even his transformed state couldn't allow him to follow a demon Primarch into a warp rift that was actively excluding him. As the portal sealed, as Lorgar vanished to safety, Corax stood on the threshold between realities, one cheek bloodied and bruised from the battle, damage that would have been inconceivable to inflict on a Primarch through normal means. But that damage was nothing compared to what Corax had done to Lorgar. The demon Primarch would bear new scars from this encounter, wounds that even his warp-touched nature couldn't fully heal. And more significantly, he now knew that there was a hunter in the Eye of Terror who could find him, who could hurt him, and who would never stop pursuing him. As the portal sealed completely, Corax's voice echoed through the shrine, amplified by his warp-touched nature, so that every word-bearer on Sycharis could hear it. "I have your scent now, Lorgar. I will find you. I will destroy you and every vessel you have filled with your taint." The word-bearers, who survived the battle on Sycharis, later testified that Lorgar immediately began preparing new defenses, new rituals, new ways to mask his presence from the hunter who had invaded his domain. The demon Primarch, who had once seemed supremely confident in his power, who had believed his ascension to demon prince status made him untouchable, was now acting like prey rather than predator. Because that's what he had become. In transforming Corax into the avatar of darkness, the Eye of Terror had created something that even demon primarchs feared. And Corax would spend the next 10,000 years proving that fear was justified. Power analysis. How strong is Corvus Corax? Now we arrive at the question that has driven this entire exploration. Exactly how strong is Corvus Corax? We've examined his origins, his abilities, his combat record, and his transformation. We've seen him in his original form as a Primarch of the Great Crusade, and in his evolved state as the warp-touched hunter of the Eye of Terror. But to truly answer this question, we must synthesize all this information and place Corax within the broader context of the Warhammer 40,000 universe's power scale. Let us begin with Corax in his original, unmodified Primarch form, the warrior who fought during the Great Crusade and the Horus heresy. In this state, Corax stood firmly in the upper echelon of Primarch combat effectiveness. While he might not have been able to match the pure physical power of beings like Vulcan, or the sustained berserker fury of Angron, his combination of speed, precision, and tactical acumen made him extraordinarily dangerous in the right circumstances. Against typical opponents, baseline humans, or even heavily armed and armored enemies, Corax was simply unstoppable. His speed alone made him effectively immune to conventional weapons fire. He could cross distances and eliminate targets faster than human reflexes could track. Add to this his Wraith Slip ability, which made him functionally invisible when he chose to be, and you have a being who could infiltrate any position, eliminate any target, and vanish without trace. Against Space Marines, Corax remained overwhelmingly superior. While an Astartes could perhaps survive a few seconds in his presence through their enhanced reflexes and power armor, that survival was temporary at best. The accounts we have of Corax fighting through squads or even companies of enemy Marines describe it as less of a battle and more of a massacre, with the Ravenlord moving through enemy formations like a scythe through wheat. Against other Primarchs, the picture becomes more nuanced. As we've seen, Corax completely dominated Lorgar in their fight at Istvan V, would have killed him had Kurzi not intervened. This tells us that against Primarchs who weren't primarily focused on martial prowess, Corax held overwhelming advantages. His speed and combat skills simply exceeded what warriors like Lorgar, who had spent their development focusing on scholarship and faith rather than warfare, could match. But against the more martially inclined Primarchs, Corax's advantages became less absolute. While he could certainly fight warriors like Horus, Russ, or the Lion, the outcomes of such battles would depend heavily on circumstances. In an open, straightforward duel where his stealth advantages were negated, Corax would likely struggle against these more combat-focused brothers. But give him the ability to choose the time and place of the engagement, to leverage his infiltration abilities and strike from an advantageous position, and his chances improve dramatically. This situational nature of Corax's strength is important to understand. Unlike Primarchs, whose power was relatively constant regardless of circumstances, Corax's effectiveness varied wildly depending on whether he could fight on his own terms. In an arena duel with no opportunity for stealth or surprise, he might rank in the middle of the Primarch combat hierarchy. But in a real-world military engagement, where he could use all his abilities and tactical acumen, he ranked much higher. Now let us consider Corax after his transformation in the Eye of Terror. Here, the power scaling becomes much more difficult to assess because we're dealing with abilities that transcend normal physical reality. The transformed Corax demonstrated capabilities that put him on par with demon Primarchs, beings who had fully given themselves to chaos and received its blessing in return. His fight with the Daemon Prince Lorgar provides our best data point. Not only did Corax hold his own against a being who should have been vastly more powerful than the original Primarch he had fought at Istvan V, but he actually dominated the encounter. Lorgar, with 10,000 years of development as a demon prince, with all the powers that Chaos Undivided could grant, was forced to retreat rather than continue the battle. This isn't just impressive, it's almost unprecedented. Demon Primarchs are supposed to be the ultimate expression of Chaos's power, warriors who have transcended their original limitations and become living avatars of the warp itself. They're functionally immortal in the sense that destroying their physical form merely banishes them back to the warp, from which they can eventually return. They wield powers that reshape reality, that corrupt everything they touch, that make conventional warfare obsolete. Yet Corax not only fought such a being, but inflicted wounds that Lorgar couldn't simply regenerate from, damage that persisted even after the battle ended. This suggests that the transformed Corax had acquired the ability to harm beings on a fundamental spiritual level, not just damaging their physical manifestation, but actually injuring their essential nature. In the context of Warhammer 40,000's power scaling, this is an extraordinary capability, one that elevates Corax to a level occupied by only the most powerful beings in the entire setting. The nature of Corax's transformation deserves particular analysis. Unlike the demon Primarchs who serve Chaos, Corax achieved his evolution without pledging himself to any of the dark gods. His statement that, underneath the veneer of humanity our Father crafted for us, we are of the warp, suggests he discovered something fundamental about the Primarch's nature and found a way to embrace that warp-touched essence without accepting Chaos's dominion. This distinction is crucial. Demon Primarchs are powerful, but their power comes with strings attached. They serve the Chaos gods, are bound by their patrons' whims and desires. Corax appears to have achieved a similar level of warp infusion without those limitations. He's not serving anyone but himself and his own desire for vengeance. This independence arguably makes him more dangerous than the demon Primarchs, because he can't be predicted or controlled through understanding of his patron's goals. The specific abilities Corax displayed in his transformed state defy easy categorization. He can exist as pure shadow, a form that seems to be immune to physical harm while still capable of inflicting it. This isn't simply invisibility or intangibility. It's a fundamental alteration of his state of being, existing partially outside conventional reality. He can scatter his consciousness and essence across multiple forms, manifesting as a flock of ravens that can each attack independently before reforming into his singular form. This provides both tactical flexibility and makes him extraordinarily difficult to truly harm, since destroying any single raven doesn't destroy him. His attacks damage opponents on a spiritual level, not just physically. This was demonstrated by his ability to harm Lorgar in ways that the Daemon Primarch couldn't simply regenerate from. In Warhammer 40,000's universe, where many powerful beings are functionally immortal because they can reconstitute their physical forms, the ability to inflict persistent spiritual damage is devastatingly powerful. He retains and has perhaps enhanced his original Wraithslip ability, now operating on a scale that makes him essentially undetectable even to beings with supernatural senses. The Wordbearers, who had millennia of experience dealing with demons and warp entities, couldn't track or predict him despite all their skills and resources. Perhaps most importantly, he seems to have unlimited endurance in his warp-touched form. Unlike his original Primarch body which, while incredibly resilient, could still be worn down through sustained combat, his transformed state shows no signs of tiring or degrading. He can hunt for what appears to be indefinite periods, pursuing his prey across the Eye of Terror for centuries without rest. When we compare this transformed Corax to other beings in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, we find very few who can match this combination of capabilities. The demon Primarchs, as we've seen, can be fought and even driven off by him. Greater demons, the most powerful servants of the Chaos gods, short of the gods themselves, would likely find Corax an extremely difficult opponent. His ability to inflict spiritual damage and his warp-touched nature allowing him to fight them on their own level. The Emperor himself, in his original form before being interred in the Golden Throne, would certainly have been more powerful than Corax. Similarly, the Chaos Gods, in their full manifestation, would vastly exceed even the transformed Ravenlord's capabilities. But below these highest tiers of power, Corax stands among the most formidable entities in the entire setting. It's worth noting that Corax's transformation seems to be ongoing, not a single event, but a continuous evolution. The Corax who fought Lorgar on Sikaris may not represent his final form. If he continues to adapt, to grow more powerful as he spends more time in the Eye of Terror, there's no clear limit to what he might eventually become. He could potentially evolve into something that rivals even the Daemon Primarchs in their most empowered states, all while maintaining his independence from Chaos's corruption. This presents a fascinating question. Is there a point at which Corax's pursuit of vengeance, his immersion in the warp and embrace of its power, becomes indistinguishable from falling to chaos? He claims he hasn't fallen, that he's merely embracing the warp-touch nature that was always part of the Primarch's design. But the line between using chaos and being used by chaos has never been particularly clear. Many who believed they were merely channeling the warp's power for their own purposes eventually found themselves corrupted, their goals subverted, their very nature twisted, until they became servants of the dark gods they thought they were exploiting. Yet Corax has maintained his independence for 10,000 years. He hasn't shown signs of the degradation that typically accompanies chaos corruption. His goals remain consistent, his tactical acumen intact, his essential nature recognizable even in his transformed state. This suggests that whatever he's become, it's genuinely different from the demon princes who serve chaos, that he's found some third path between loyalty to the Emperor's original vision and service to the dark gods. From a practical standpoint, assessing how strong Corvus Corax is requires acknowledging that strength in Warhammer 40,000 isn't just about raw power, but about capability and effectiveness. In his original form, Corax was one of the most effective Primarchs at achieving military objectives, his legion consistently punching above its weight class through superior tactics and precision operations. After his transformation, he became effective in a different way, as a hunter and assassin operating at a cosmic scale, capable of threatening even demon Primarchs who should be far beyond any single warrior's ability to challenge. If we were to assign numerical ratings, purely for the sake of comparison, we might say that original Primarch Corax operated at perhaps an 8 or 9 out of 10 on the Primarch power scale, with beings like Horus, Sanguinius, and the Lion representing the top tier. Transformed Corax, however, has seemingly broken through the ceiling of that scale entirely, operating at a level that might be considered 11 or 12 there. Capable of contending with demon Primarchs who themselves represent evolved forms of the original Primarch template. Legacy and current status. The disappearance of Corvus Corax into the Eye of Terror left a void within the Imperium that has never been fully filled. The Raven Guard and their successor chapters continue to operate according to the principles their Primarch established, specializing in infiltration, precision strikes, and surgical elimination of enemy leadership. But they do so in the shadow of their father's absence, never quite certain if he's still alive, if he'll ever return, if the whispered rumors of his continued existence are true or merely wishful thinking. The impact of Corax's departure on his sons cannot be overstated. Other chapters whose Primarchs disappeared or died could at least claim that their fathers fell in service to the Imperium, died heroically fighting its enemies, or sacrificed themselves for some greater good. But Corax chose to leave. He walked away from his legion, from the Imperium, from everything he had built, driven by guilt and the need for vengeance. For the Raven Guard who remained, this abandonment, however understandable, has been a wound that 10,000 years hasn't fully healed. Yet that abandonment came with a gift of sorts, though it took millennia for anyone to realize it. The transformation of Corvus Corax into the Avatar of Darkness, his evolution into a being capable of hunting demon Primarchs in their own realm, means that the forces of chaos face a threat they cannot ignore. Somewhere in the Eye of Terror, An unstoppable hunter stalks them, patient, relentless, impossible to permanently defeat. The traitor Primarchs who participated in the drop site massacre, who believed they had crushed the Raven Guard beyond recovery, now know that vengeance never rests, that their betrayal has created an enemy who will pursue them across eternity itself. Lorgar Aurelian, in particular, has spent the last 10,000 years effectively in hiding. The Word-Bearer's Primarch, once so confident in his demonic ascension, now rarely leaves his sanctum on Sycharis. When he does emerge, it's briefly, cautiously, always with the awareness that somewhere in the shifting chaos of the eye, Corax might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The proud warrior priest, who once sought to spread his faith across the galaxy, has been reduced to something resembling prey, constantly looking over his shoulder for shadows that might contain death. The psychological impact of this on the Word-Bearer's Legion has been significant. They worship their Primarch as a god, see him as the pinnacle of Chaos's power and favor. Yet they've witnessed him flee from Corvus Corax, have seen him wounded and fearful. This has created fractures within the Legion, different factions arguing over how to interpret their god's seeming weakness. Some claim that Lorgar's caution is wisdom, that he preserves himself for some greater purpose that will be revealed when the time is right. Others whisper that perhaps their father is not as powerful as they believed, that his ascension was incomplete or flawed in some way. Similar effects ripple through the other traitor legions who participated in Istvan V. The Night Lords, Conrad Kurz's sons, have lost their Primarch but gain occasional reports of something hunting in the eye that uses tactics disturbingly similar to their own. The Alpha Legion, masters of infiltration and deception, have developed new protocols specifically for detecting potential Corax infiltration, never quite certain if the shadows around them are truly empty. Even the Iron Warriors and Word-Bearers, legions with no particular connection to Corax, have developed a healthy respect for the possibility that their positions in the eye might be penetrated by an enemy who can walk through their defenses as if they don't exist. In the Imperium proper, Corvus Corax has achieved a kind of mythological status, particularly among the Raven Guard and their successors. There are shrines dedicated to him across dozens of worlds, temples where his example is celebrated and his eventual return is prayed for. The Feast of the Deliverer, held annually on Deliverance, commemorates both his liberation of that world and his assumed death in service to the Emperor. Raven Guard chaplains tell stories of their Primarch's deeds, emphasizing his tactical genius, his compassion for the oppressed, his determination to minimize unnecessary casualties. But these official accounts carefully avoid mentioning certain details. The Raptor project and its catastrophic failure remain largely sealed, known only to the highest echelons of Raven Guard leadership. The full extent of Corax's transformation in the Eye of Terror is similarly restricted information. The Imperium has enough problems with warp corruption without its citizens knowing that a supposedly loyal Primarch has become a warp-touched entity that exists partially outside normal reality. There have been occasional sightings, unconfirmed reports that filter out of the Eye of Terror or from nearby regions of space. A Word-Bearer's warband, destroyed by an unknown assailant who left symbols of the Raven Guard behind. Traitor forces reporting being hunted by something that defied explanation. Each time, the Raven Guard investigates, hoping for confirmation that their father still lives, still fights. But confirmation never comes, only hints and suggestions that might mean everything or nothing. The question of whether Corvus Corax will ever return to the Imperium proper remains unanswered. Some argue that he can't return, that his transformation has changed him too fundamentally, that the warp-touched entity he's become wouldn't be welcome in an Imperium that executes any who show signs of corruption. Others suggest that he doesn't want to return, that his mission of vengeance is all that matters to him now, that the guilt and failure he feels over Istvan V and the Raptor project has convinced him he doesn't deserve to be called father by the Raven Guard anymore. There are darker theories as well. Some whisper that Corax has already fallen to chaos, that his claim of remaining loyal while embracing the warp is self-deception, and that eventually he'll emerge not as a savior, but as yet another traitor. Primarch, yet another fallen son, adding to the Emperor's grief. These theories are officially condemned as heretical, but they persist nonetheless, fueled by the undeniable fact that no one who has spent 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror should be able to remain uncorrupted. Yet the evidence suggests otherwise. The Corax who hunts in the Eye targets traitors, chaos worshippers, and those who betrayed the Imperium. He doesn't indiscriminately slaughter or spread corruption. His actions remain consistent with his original values of justice and the punishment of those who deserve it. If he has fallen, he's fallen in a way that's unprecedented, becoming something that serves neither the Emperor nor chaos, but some third agenda understood only by him. In the current timeline of Warhammer 40,000, with the Great Rift splitting the galaxy and demon primarchs, like Magnus and Mortarion, returning to lead attacks on the Imperium, the potential return of Corvus Corax takes on new significance. The Imperium needs its primarchs now more than ever, needs every advantage it can muster against the horrors that press in from all sides. A primarch who can fight demon princes on their own level, who can infiltrate chaos-held territory and eliminate high-value targets, would be an asset beyond measure. But would the Imperium accept him? Would the Inquisition allow a being so thoroughly touched by the warp to operate freely, even if he claimed loyalty? Would the Raven Guard themselves, seeing what their father has become, be able to reconcile the warp-touched avatar of darkness with the Primarch they remember? These questions have no clear answers, which may be why Corax, if he's even capable of returning, chooses not to. The legacy Corvus Corax leaves is complex and multifaceted. He's remembered as a liberator, a tactical genius, a compassionate commander who valued his sons' lives and tried to minimize civilian casualties. He's also remembered as a figure of tragedy, a primarch who suffered more failures than most, who watched his legion nearly destroyed and his attempts to rebuild it turn into nightmare. And he exists, somewhere in the Eye of Terror, as a legend and a warning, a demonstration of what happens when a Primarch refuses to accept defeat, refuses to let go of vengeance, refuses to be anything less than what he believes justice demands. For the Raven Guard, their Primarch's absence has become almost as defining as his presence once was. They fight in his name, uphold his principles, maintain his tactical doctrines, all while knowing that the father who established those traditions may never return to see how faithfully they've been preserved. It's a peculiar kind of faith, believing in someone who chose to leave, who walked away into darkness and never looked back, yet whose example continues to inspire 10,000 years later. And perhaps that's the final answer to how strong Corvus Corax truly is. His strength isn't measured solely in combat prowess or supernatural abilities, though those are considerable. It's measured in the legacy he left behind, in the sons who continue to fight in his name, in the principles he established that have survived millennia. It's measured in the fear he inspires in the traitors who destroyed his legion, the knowledge that somewhere in the warp, an enemy who will never forgive, never forget, never stop hunting, waits for them. Corvus Corax is as strong as vengeance itself, as patient as shadow, as relentless as the passage of time. He is the proof that even in defeat, even broken and nearly destroyed, a Primarch can find a way to continue the fight, to make the enemy pay, to ensure that betrayal, no matter how complete, is never without consequence. Conclusion: the strength of shadow and vengeance. We began this journey asking a simple question. How strong is Corvus Corax in Warhammer 40,000? As we've discovered, the answer is anything but simple. Corax's strength cannot be measured by a single metric or reduced to a numerical power level. It exists across multiple dimensions: physical capability, tactical genius, psychological warfare, and in his transformed state, supernatural abilities that transcend normal understanding. In his original form as a Primarch, Corax represented the peak of what the Emperor's genetic engineering could achieve when optimized for speed, precision, and stealth warfare. He could fight and defeat other Primarchs who weren't primarily focused on martial prowess. He could infiltrate positions that should have been impenetrable, eliminate targets that should have been unreachable, and vanish before anyone realized what had happened. His combination of superhuman physical abilities and near-supernatural stealth made him one of the most effective special operations assets the Imperium ever possessed. But physical capability was never the full measure of Corax's strength. His true power lay in how he thought, in his capacity to analyze battlefield conditions and identify the precise action that would achieve victory with minimum cost. Other Primarchs might win battles through overwhelming force or brilliant frontal assaults, but Corax won wars by ensuring that by the time the battle was joined, the enemy had already lost. His decapitation strikes, his infiltration missions, his systematic dismantling of enemy command structures, these were the hallmarks of a warrior who understood that strength isn't just about how hard you can hit, but about knowing exactly where to hit and when. The tragedy of Istvan V and the subsequent failure of the Raptor project revealed another dimension of strength, resilience in the face of failure. Corax could have allowed these defeats to break him completely, could have retreated into obscurity or simply given up. Instead, he transmuted his failure into purpose, his guilt into determination, his loss into a quest for vengeance that would span 10,000 years. This psychological strength, the capacity to continue functioning despite carrying burdens that would crush lesser beings, may be Corax's most impressive quality. And then there's the transformation, the evolution into something that transcends his original design. The avatar of darkness that Corax has become represents a power level that puts him in the same category as demon Primarchs, beings who should vastly exceed any loyalist Primarch's capabilities. Yet Corax achieved this evolution without pledging himself to chaos, without accepting corruption in exchange for power. He found a third path, embraced the warp-touched nature that was always part of his being while maintaining his independence and his essential goals. This transformed Corax is strong enough to hunt demon Primarchs in their own realm, to inflict wounds that their warp-stuffed bodies cannot simply regenerate from, to instill fear in beings who should be beyond such mortal emotions. He's strong enough to operate in the eye of terror for millennia without succumbing to the corruption that consumes nearly every other being who enters that cursed realm. He's strong enough to maintain his purpose, his identity, his essential self, despite being immersed in an environment designed to shatter sanity and twist souls. So, how strong is Corvus Corax? He's strong enough to matter, even 10,000 years after his disappearance. He's strong enough to haunt the nightmares of traitor Primarchs who thought they were safe in their warp-touched domains. He's strong enough to inspire his sons to continue fighting in his name, to maintain his principles and tactical doctrines across 100 successor chapters. He's strong enough to serve as a warning that betrayal, no matter how complete or how long ago, will eventually face consequences. But perhaps the most important aspect of Corax's strength is what it represents. In a universe as grim-dark as Warhammer 40,000, where hope is a dangerous luxury and victory is often measured in degrees of loss rather than gain, Corvus Corax stands as proof that even the most devastating defeats can be survived. He demonstrates that strength can take many forms, that sometimes the most powerful response to overwhelming force is not to meet it head-on, but to strike from shadows at vulnerable points. He shows that vengeance, when pursued with sufficient determination and patience, can transcend time itself. The Raven Lord, the Deliverer, the Avatar of Darkness, Corvus Corax, in all his forms, represents a particular kind of strength that resonates throughout the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It's the strength of the underdog who refuses to accept defeat, the strength of the shadow that even the brightest lights cannot fully dispel, the strength of memory that ensures the dead are never truly gone, so long as someone remains to avenge them. In the end, answering how strong is Corvus Corax requires understanding that strength in Warhammer 40,000 isn't just about how many enemies you can kill or how much punishment you can endure. It's about impact, about legacy, about the mark you leave on a galaxy that tries to grind everyone down into dust and obscurity. By that measure, Corvus Corax is among the strongest beings in the entire setting, a Primarch whose story spans 10,000 years and whose final chapter has yet to be written. Wherever he is now, whatever he's become, Corvus Corax continues to fight his war in the shadows, patient and relentless, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the hearts of those who betrayed everything he held dear. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that kind of strength, that kind of determination, that kind of vengeance might be exactly what the galaxy needs. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of Warhammer 40,000's most fascinating Primarchs. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Corvus Corax's story and capabilities, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. The Emperor protects, but knowledge prepares, and there are many more stories waiting to be told in the dark millennia of mankind's eternal war.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.